Anyway, thank you all for being here. I first came to DLD in 2014, and I was thinking how different it is now versus then. And back in 2014, it was all optimism, right? I mean, technology was ascendant. We didn't talk as much about the downsides. We occasionally would talk about privacy, but mostly it was all up and to the right, okay? And I think back then it was different. Facebook was 2 years after its IPO, and there was still hope that overall the internet overall was a force of good. And I think some of the shines come off on that, and I think you can see it in some of the sessions now. I mean, and there was one about is democracy doomed, basically. So we're getting a bit of a reality check, and I think that in the theme is obvious. And I think when I think about it, I think about the sort of macro promises of the internet, and that it was going to, particularly in the information realm, it was going to make information available for free, and that it would be geared towards specific interests, and it would be backed up by great business models that were mostly advertising, and they could reach any number of people, and there wouldn't be the artificial constraints of the analog era. And of course, that's disappointed at the end of the day, right? I mean, we have to be honest about it. And there's never been more misinformation out there. Publishing has struggled, and it continues to struggle. And I think that it needs to rethink, in many ways, how it operates. I think a little bit about, I talk about farm-to-table media. I don't know if you know the farm-to-table movement with restaurants and food industry, and that's trying to get out of this mechanized era of how we eat and to connect more the farmers to the actual food on the table. And it's smaller, it's more craft, it's more human. And I think we're at the start of seeing publishing move in that direction. So I had taken out because I know there's only 15 minutes, and so there's a gong that goes, and I don't want to get the gong. That's my goal. So let's start by what went wrong, real quick. When you start something new, you always try to define yourself as what you are not. And when the internet publishing industry started, it decided to differentiate itself from analog media by saying, hey, that John Wanamaker quote that said that 50% of my advertising is wasted? We're going to solve for that because we're going to be able to tell if your advertising worked. We're going to do that through two methods, but mostly through the click. Okay, and even this is the first banner ad that was ever shown, and it was promising that you were going to click on ads, and a lot of people did click on them. Like 10% clicked on this ad. And the thing with interaction rates is they go in one direction, they go down. And the only way that this works is if you adopt a direct marketing mindset. And the internet was doomed from that point forward to be a direct marketing medium because of that and the other original sin, which was that the internet separated the audience data from the media impression. And this was a great trick. I remember an ad agency executive, promising and said, someday only dog owners will see dog food ads. I'm not sure if that was quite of a nirvana that he was making it out to be, but that was the promise of it. Now, marketers love this, but publishers, not so much, because that screwed with their model. I always remember, back in the early internet days, Mel Karmazin, who was running Viacom, big traditional media company, went to visit Google. And at the time, Google was not as prominent and powerful as it was. And they walked through their advertising system, walked him through their advertising system, and he was like, "You're messing with the magic, boys." And he used a different word other than messing. But what he was saying was that advertising and media has always been about pizzazz. It's always been about some of the more qualitative aspect. And by making it a math problem, that they were fundamentally changing the media world. And of course they did. And guess who won? The technology companies basically did eat media. And so what that led to publishers doing is they became basically vassals of technology platforms because there was no choice, because they had to rely on the platforms for their traffic, they had to rely on the platforms for how they made money, and there was no way that publishers could compete on their own or even together with the power of platforms. They just simply did not, publishers simply did not have the data, okay? And platforms were always going to have more data than publishers. That's why I believe that it's dumb for publishers to try to fight on that basis. So what they did was they gave away their strategy to platforms. They just had to follow what platforms said. That's why they had all these pivots, pivoting to apps, pivoting to chatbots, pivoting to video. Whatever Facebook cooked up, for whatever reason, publishers had to follow. And that's why it was reminded of this Peanuts cartoon. I don't know if you remember this, but Charlie Brown was trying to kick an American football, and Lucy pulled it out from under him and he went flying. But in the show, he kept trying it again and again and again, as if the result was going to be different. I'm often reminded of that with the publishing industry because that's what publishers kept doing. To be fair, they didn't have that much of a choice. But what that ended up leading to is what I think of as adversarial business models. And publishing is always a difficult business when you rely on advertising because your true customers are advertisers and your audience is really the product, right? But then when platforms became so powerful, then it became even more complicated because you were trying to satisfy advertisers, your audience, and algorithms. And so what happened was a lot of times publishers were trying to make up for the declining ad rates by just loading more pages, more ads on the page and trying to do whatever they could to make money. Now, when you treat your audience like crap, generally you're not going to engender a lot of trust. So it's no surprise that users are not trusting publishers too much. And I don't think that's a long-term strategy. And then the final thing is, or the other thing is that, publishers bought into this myth of scale, and the idea was we're going to make up for the fact that we make less money off these ads by more. We're just going to have bigger audiences, and so you ran into these situations where, like a Refinery 29, for instance, was founded as a specific publication for women and also with fashion and beauty. And next thing you know, they were doing general news. I mean, in 2014, they were covering, Ukraine and things like this. And this never worked. The scale era was a disaster for publishers because basically they could never amass a big enough audience. And the numbers were very fleeting. People would say they had 1 billion video views on Facebook, and then you would ask how much money you made, and they would change the subject. And so that was all gone. I just think about when I was here in 2014, I did a panel, and on the panel was Scott Lamb from BuzzFeed, which at the time was valued at $1.7 billion, which is now valued at a third of that as a publicly traded company. There was Elite Daily was on that, David from Elite Daily, and Elite Daily basically got to 30 million users within a few years, geared at young men. They basically disappeared off the face of the earth 5 years later. All that audience came from Facebook. Upworthy was here talking. Eli Freezer was here. They went from 0 to 50 million in about 2 years. Forbes called them the fastest growing publisher in history. They went to 0, basically. They got bought for parts. So that was a big mistake. But in trying to make money, publishers also, outside of the biggest ones, had to develop gigantic infrastructures because they had to, they realized that advertising was not going to do it. So I was like, well, we'll make money in other ways. Well, then pretty soon, they were taking their eye off the ball with investing in what their core competency was, which is creating great content. In case of news publishers, great journalism. And instead, they were doing all of these other things that made being profitable really difficult. So what I think we've seen is what I call the unbundling of publishing. That's why I think Substack is really interesting. I left, I was the president of Digiday Media, and we had publications covering media and marketing, but also in fashion and beauty, and another in retail. And I saw what was happening with moves to newsletters and podcasts, and I decided to leave and start the Rebooting as a podcast and a newsletter because I think that there is something interesting going on with the lack of trust in institutions. We're seeing it across all of society, right? But people trust individuals more than they trust institutions. And that's why, that 1 million people pay for email newsletters is really remarkable. There's a reason that podcasters are so popular and have such a hold on their listeners. And that's because it's a more human medium. And I think that the future of publishing is probably going to be in large part, outside of like the New York Times and a few on the very large scale, is going to be smaller, more focused, and more human. Because when you go niche, like you can mean something to a defined group of people. And I think that was the original hope of the internet, and it sort of got blown off course with this idea that you could build like these massive billion-dollar businesses. There'll be a few billion-dollar businesses, but most will be a lot smaller, and I think you can build more sustainable businesses that way. And the other thing is, the business models themselves are moving from an indirect model, mostly advertising, to a direct model that's based around subscriptions. I was just listening to the New York Times talk next door, and shifting to subscriptions allowed them to refocus their entire organization and simplify their business model. They go in and they leave just thinking about how can we create journalism that's worth paying for. So I think right now that is going to lead to a rebundling. And some of the aspects of the rebundling that I think you're going to see is you have to suck the costs out. You have to simplify the business models for most publishers in order to have the most of your investment going into the content. I'm biased since I'm on the content side, but I think it's the most important thing that publishers do. But in order to do that, you have to have more simple business models. And the other thing is, I think the publishers of the future are going to be audience first. You cannot keep treating your audience as adversaries. And they're also going to be talent first. It doesn't mean it's all going to be individual newsletters or anything like this, but people trust people more than faceless institutions. The institutional imprimatur still matters, but at the same time, like people want, and I think coming out of a pandemic, they want to feel more of a human connection. I mean, that's why we all came to Munich to here, is because DLD is a community. And thank you, Steffi. I knew that she would agree with me. And because we're not an audience, we're a community, correct? And that is really, really important because, we're humans at the end of the day, and we want to connect with each other. And so the most powerful publishing companies of the future, I think, are going to tap into communities. They might be smaller, right? And that's okay because you can't try to be everything to everyone. I mean, that was already tried in the scale era. So I think it would be better to try something new by having more human models, even if they're a little bit smaller. And finally, lists, not page views. And because you need to have a direct connection with people. Even if it's fewer people, the idea that these publications had these massive audiences was never true. Those audiences were Facebook's and they were Google's, and they were renting those audiences, right? So like, if you're able to have a direct connection, whether an email subscription or someone subscribing to a podcast, little imperfect, both are imperfect, that allows you to have more control over your business and not give your business basically over to giant technology platforms. So that's it. Thank you very much. I didn't get the gong.